There is a moment in war that history rarely captures. It does not appear in photographs. It is not written in after-action reports that no medal is awarded for it. It is the moment when a soldier stops feeling fear. Fear is supposed to be the final barrier between life and death. It is a bodillos alarm system alarming. It sharpens the senses, tightens the muscles, forces the mind to focus on one thing, survival. But in World War II, millions of soldiers crossed a psychological line that humans were never meant to cross. They did not become fearless heroes. They did not suddenly grow brave. They became numb. Veterans from every side of the conflict, American, German, Soviet, British, Japanese, would later describe the same experience in hauntingly similar words. I remember the exact moment when I realized I wasn't afraid anymore, and that scared me more than the bullets ever did. This was not courage, this was collapse. WW2 was the first war fought without pause. Previous wars had rhythms, battles, amisro soldier rested. Fear surged and then faded, but World War II erased that rhythm. Artillery did not stop at night. Bombers did not wait for daylight. Front lines did not stabilize for long. Death arrived at random from the sky, from the ground, from nowhere at all. A soldier could do everything right and still die instantly. Another could make a mistake and survive. There was no logic, no fairness, no warning, and the human mind cannot endure constant uncertainty forever. At first, fear was overwhelming. New soldiers shook uncontrollably. They vomited before combat. Some cried openly, some froze, unable to move. Military training tried to suppress this reaction, but fear always found a way through. Then something changed. After weeks, months, sometimes years of exposure, fear stopped working. The explosions were still there, the gunfire was still there. Dis-toi! Still everywhere, but the emotional response was gone. Soldiers began describing the world as distant, muted, unreal. Sounds felt muffled. Colors seemed drained. Time slowed down or sped up unpredictably. Psychologists would later call this dissociation. At the time, soldiers simply called it being empty. This emptiness was not peaceful. It was disturbing. Because fear, for all its pain, is proof that the mind is still fighting to survive. When fear disappears, the brain has given up on warning the body. One German soldier on the Eastern Front wrote in his diary, "The shells fall closer now, but I no longer react. I know I should be afraid. I just don't feel it." On the surface, this looked like bravery. Officers praised soldiers who did not flinch under fire. Men who walked calmly through bombardments were admired. But military doctors began to notice something troubling. These fearless soldiers were not more effective, they were more reckless. They exposed themselves unnecessarily, they ignored cover. They took risks that made no tactical sense. Some walked directly into machine gun fire without hesitation, not because they believed they would survive, but because survival no longer felt relevant. World War to force the human nervous system into a state it was never designed to sustain. Fear is meant to be temporary, a spike that fades once danger passes. But in this war, danger never passed. The brain tried to maintain high alert for too long. Adrenaline flooded the body day after day. Stress hormones remained elevated without relief. Sleep was fragmented or impossible. Eventually, the brain activated an emergency response. It did not make the soldier stronger. It shut down emotional processing altogether. Fear was not conquered. It was silenced. This is the critical misunderstanding that shaped so many myths about World War to heroism. When soldiers stopped feeling fear, they were not transcending humanity. They were it. Fearless soldiers were often the ones closest to psychological breakdown. They had reached the limit of endurance and crossed it. A U.S. Army psychiatrist would later write, "When fear disappears completely, the soldier is no longer adapting. He is deteriorating." The absence of fear did not mean peace. It meant the mind had exhausted its last defense. And once that happened, the damage was often permanent. This was the true invisible wound of World War II. No shell. Fragments, not bullets. But the quiet moment when a man realized that death no longer frightened him. And nothing else did either. That moment marked the beginning of psychological collapse, and once it began, there was no clear way back. Fear is not a weakness, it is a biological system. For hundreds of thousands of years, fear kept humans alive. It warned us of predators. It forced us to react faster than conscious thought. The human brain evolved for danger, but only in short bursts. A sudden threat, a rapid decision, then safety. World War II destroyed that balance. In war, fear did not arrive suddenly and then disappear. It stayed, day after day, night after night. To understand why soldiers eventually stopped feeling fear, we must understand how fear actually works inside the brain. At the center of this system is a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala does not think, it reacts. It scans the environment constantly, searching for threats. When it detects danger, it triggers a cascade of responses. Heart rate increases, breathing accelerates, muscles tense. Adrenaline and cortisol flood the bloodstream. This happens faster than conscious thought. In civilian life, this system rarely activates for long. A near accident, a loud noise, a sudden shock. The body reacts to normal. But on the battlefields of World War II, the amygdala was never allowed to rest. Artillery could last for hours, sometimes days. Bombers appeared without warning. Snipers turned silence into terror. The brain treated every second as potentially lethal. And it paid a price. When stress hormones remain elevated for too long, they stop being helpful. Cortisol begins damaging memory formation. Adrenaline exhausts the nervous system. Sleep becomes fragmented or disappears entirely. The brain enters what modern neuroscience calls chronic survival mode. In this state, emotional, regulation, empathy are suppressed. Survival becomes the only priority, or at first, fear intensifies. Soldiers become hyper-alert. Every sound feels dangerous. Every shadow looks like an enemy. But the human brain cannot sustain hypervigilance indefinitely. Eventually, something breaks. The amygdala continues firing alarm signals, but the rest of the brain stops responding. This is not a conscious decision. It is neurological self-defense. Psychologists call this process habituation. When the brain is exposed to the same overwhelming stimulus repeatedly, it reduces its response. The explosions do not stop. The response does. Fear fades. Not because danger is gone, but because the brain is overloaded. This is why so many World War II veterans described the same sensation. I knew I was in danger. I just didn't feel afraid. This emotional disconnect is known as emotional numbing. It is closely linked to dissociation, the feeling of being detached from one's body, emotions, or surroundings. For the soldier, this numbness often felt like relief at first. No more shaking hands. No more panics, no attack. But this relief was deceptive. Fear is not only an emotion, it is information. It tells the body when to seek cover, when to retreat, when to be cautious. When fear disappears, the brain loses a critical warning system. Military doctors began noticing strange behaviors. Soldiers standing upright under fire. Men walking calmly through artillery zones. Others volunteering for suicidal missions without hesitation. These soldiers were not courageous in the traditional sense. They were disconnected from consequence. The brain had stopped projecting the future. Modern neuroscience suggests that emotional numbing disrupts the brain's ability to imagine outcomes. If the future feels unreal, death loses its emotional weight. One British officer observed, "The men who scared me the most were the ones who weren't scared at all." Because fearless soldiers did not protect themselves, they became unpredictable. This terrified commanders, not for moral reasons, but practical ones. A soldier who does not fear death is not more effective. He is less controllable. World War II forced militaries to confront an uncomfortable truth. Psychological collapse does not always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like calm. In fact, the most dangerous stage of mental breakdown often comes after fear. Disappears, but the body keeps functioning. The soldier keeps moving, but the mind is no longer fully present. This is why so many breakdowns happened suddenly. A soldier might perform flawlessly for months. Then, without warning, he would collapse. Freeze, lose speech, wander away from his unit. The system had been running on empty for too long. Fear had been switched off, and nothing was left to hold the structure together. World War II exposed the limits of the human nervous system, not through a single traumatic event, but through duration. The war did not overwhelm the brain with one unbearable moment. It overwhelmed it with endless ones. And when fear reached its biological limit, the brain did what it had to do to survive. It shut down. The soldier remained standing, but part of his humanity was gone. When the first soldiers began collapsing in World War II, military doctors thought they understood the problem. They had seen it before. During World War I, men had broken down in the trenches. They shook uncontrollably. They could not speak or move. Doctors called it shell shock. At the time, many believed it was caused by physical damage, the concussion of exploding artillery, shells disrupting the brain. By the time World War II began, that theory had largely been abandoned. Psychiatrists now believed shell shock was psychological. They thought they were prepared. They were wrong. What appeared in World War II was something far more dangerous, not panic, not hysteria, but silent collapse. Soldiers were not screaming anymore. They were shutting down. Military hospitals began receiving men with no visible injuries, no wounds, no shrapnel. No signs of concussion, yet these men could not fight. Some could not speak. Some stared at walls for hours. Others wandered aimlessly, unable to explain who they were or where they were supposed to be. Doctors were confused. These men were not cowards. Many had excellent combat records. Some had been decorated for bravery. They had endured what others could not. And then, suddenly, they were empty. One U.S. Army psychiatrist wrote in his notes, "These men are not afraid. They are beyond fear." This realization changed everything. In World War I, breakdown often happened quickly, a massive bombardment, a horrifying assault. A single overwhelming event in World War II, breakdown was slow, cumulative. It was not one trauma that destroyed the mind, it was hundreds day after day, mission after mission, month after month. The mind did not explode, it eroded. Doctors began noticing a pattern. The men who collapsed were rarely new recruits, they were veterans. Men who had survived the worst fighting, men who had adapted, men who had learned how not to panic, in other words, the strong ones. A British medical officer in North Africa observed, "The weakest broke early. The strongest broke last. But nearly everyone broke eventually." This was an uncomfortable truth for military leadership. War did not test mental strength. It consumait dit fear was a force. Fear made soldiers cautious, it kept them alive. But once fear was exhausted, there was nothing left to regulate behavior. Doctors described soldiers who showed no emotional reaction to death. They stepped over bodies without looking. They watched friends die without visible response. This was not resilience. It was emotional shutdown. The military struggled to name this condition. Terms like combat exhaustion, battle fatigue, and war neurosis were used interchangeably. The lack of a clear label reflected a deeper problem. No one wanted to admit what was happening. If fearlessness was a symptom of collapse, then courage itself was suspect. That idea threatened the very foundation of military culture, and so breakdown was often misinterpreted. Commanders accused soldiers of malingering, of weakness, of cowardice. Some were court-martialed. Others were sent back to the front too soon and broke completely. Psychiatrists pushed back. They argued that psychological injury was as real as physical injury. More importantly, they argued that anyone could break. This was not about personality. It was about exposure. One American psychiatrist famously stated, "There is no such thing as a man who cannot be broken. There is only a man who has not been broken yet." WW2 forced militaries to confront a terrifying reality. Psychological collapse was not rare, it was inevitable. Given enough time, this realization led to quiet changes. Rest rotations were introduced. Frontline exposure was limited. Men were pulled back not when they showed fear, but when they stopped showing it. Doctors learned to look for warning signs, emotional flatness, lack of reaction to danger, indifference to survival, detachment from comrades. These were not signs of bravery. They were red flags. The soldier had passed the point where fear could protect him. And once that point was crossed, recovery became far more difficult. Even when removed from combat, many soldiers did not recover fully. The numbness persisted. They described feeling like ghosts, present but not alive. World War II marked a turning point in military psychology. It revealed that the human mind has limits, not dramatic limits, Kieon, limits that are crossed not with screams, but with silence. Shell shock was not the disease. It was the symptom at World War to uncover the deeper truth. When fear is stretched beyond endurance, the mind does not shatter loudly. It shuts itself down, and the most dangerous soldier on the battlefield was not the one who panicked, but the one who felt nothing at all. If World War II had a place where fear was stretched to its absolute limit, it was the Eastern Front. From the forests outside Moscow to the ruins of Stalingrad, soldiers fought in conditions that erased the idea of a front line. There was no clear beginning, no clear end. En l'exposure on the Eastern Front, death rarely came suddenly. It announced itself through sound. Artillery was constant. Shells fell day and night, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Not as preparation for an attack, but as pressure. A psychological siege. Men learned that the bombardment itself was the weapon. Waiting became the most unbearable part. Waiting for the next shell, waiting for the next scream, waiting to see if the explosion would be close enough this time. Fear did not spike, it simmered. Soviet and German veterans described the same experience despite fighting on opposite sides. The first days under artillery were terrifying. Men flinched at every explosion. They pressed themselves into the ground. They clutched their helmets like talismans. Sleep was impossible. The nervous system remained fully alert even when the body collapsed from exhaustion. Then, gradually, something changed. The explosions continued, but the reaction stopped. A German infantryman wrote, "At first, each shell felt like the end. Later, it felt like background noise. I knew this was wrong, but I could not change it. This was not adaptation. It was erosion." The brain, overwhelmed by continuous threat, began to detach from reality. Psychologists later described this as peritraumatic dissociation, the mind distancing itself during trauma to reduce pain. But on the Eastern Front, dissociation was not temporary, it became permanent. Men described feeling as if they were watching the war from outside their own bodies. Sounds felt distant, movements felt automatic. Decisions happened without conscious thought. Fear requires presence. And presence was gone. In the ruins of Stalingrad, this psychological state reached its extreme. Urban combat removed any sense of safety. There were no rear areas, no secure buildings, no predictable patterns. Snipers turned silence into danger. Rubble concealed enemies and corpses alike. Soldiers learned that even stillness was threatening. The mind responded by shutting down emotional interpretation altogether. A Red Army veteran recalled, after weeks in the city, death stopped feeling real. It happened around me, not to me. This illusion was deadly. Men exposed themselves unnecessarily. They crossed open ground without hesitation. They accepted absurd risks. Without protest, fear no longer regulated behavior. Commanders noticed something disturbing. The soldiers who appeared calm under fire were often the ones who died first. Not because they were unlucky, but because they no longer protected themselves. The Eastern Front also introduced another psychological weapon, scale. Casualties were not individual events. They were statistics. Entire units disappeared. Entire villages were erased. When death, the man stopped processing it as personal. Individual loss dissolves into abstraction. This numbing effect allowed soldiers to function in unimaginable conditions, but it also stripped death of meaning. One Soviet officer noted, "When men stop reacting to bodies, you know something inside them has broken." Waiting was the most destructive element. During long bombardments, soldiers had nothing to do but think, and the mind, trapped under constant threat, turns inward to loop. Time stretches. Minutes feel like hours. This temporal distortion intensified dissociation. Some men lost track of days entirely. Others could not remember how long they had been at the front. Fear needs a beginning and an end. Waiting provided neither. Eventually, fear exhausted itself. What remained was acceptance. Not acceptance of death, acceptance of meaninglessness. This was the true psychological collapse of the Eastern Front. Not hysteria, not panic, but resignation. Essence dat. Survival was random and therefore irrelevant. Once a soldier reached this point, removing him from the front often came too late. The numbness followed him. Even far from the battlefield, artillery echoes remained. Loud noises triggered nothing or everything at once. The mind no longer trusted safety. World War II on the Eastern Front revealed a terrifying truth. Humans can adapt to almost any level of violence, but the price of that adaptation is emotional death. The front ligne never ended, and neither did its psychological consequences. Above the European continent, between clouds and fire, a different kind of psychological war unfolded, not on the ground, not in the trenches, but in the cramped, cold, and vibrating fuselage of a bomber. The men inside these aircraft faced a unique terror. Death was measurable, predictable, statistical. Commando de number, survive à l'ode. On your 25th mission, you have a 50% chance of returning alive. Theirs weren't just warnings, they were mathematical certainties. For the first missions, fear was overwhelming. Hands shook as they gripped controls. Mouths went dry. Pilots and gunners whispered prayers. Some cried quietly in the dark before takeoff. Every flak burst made the body tense, every engine roar a reminder of mortality. The first bombing run felt like walking into hell itself, but the human mind is remarkably adaptable. After several missions, something strange happened. Fear began to fade. Not courage. Not confidence. Fear simply stopped existing. Gunners joked while flak shredded the sky around them. Pilots laughed as if danger were a distant story. They reported back with a calm that terrified their officers. This was psychological numbing in its purest form. One navigator wrote in his journal, "I no longer imagined the future. I did not think about dying. I did not think about living. I just existed." It was survival by detachment. The brain, having been exposed repeatedly to lethal risk, stopped reacting emotionally. Adrenaline spikes flattened. Heart rate normalized in the midst of chaos. Time stretched unnaturally, a long minute of calm during a storm of bullets. This allowed the men to function, to finish their mission, to drop their bombs accurately. But the cost was invisible. The absence of fear did not indicate mastery over death. It was a breakdown of instinct. The very system evolution had designed to protect them had switched off. And paradoxically, these were the most dangerous men to themselves and others. They took risks they should not have. They ignored protocol. They flew lower when altitude offered safety. They lingered too long over heavily defended targets. There, commanders noticed this pattern with growing unease. One American bomber squadron commander wrote, "The men who scare me the most are the ones who do not appear afraid. They have lost the compass that fear gives the mind." The statistiques themselves became a weapon. Each mission reduced survival odds. Each bombing run, each mechanical failure, each flak burst compounded the invisible pressure. Men did not break all at once. They were worn down like a stone in a river, slowly, continuously, without respite. Some developed combat fatigue, unable to operate machinery or fire weapons despite being physically fit. Others suffered severe dissociation, staring blankly through portholes for hours, hands frozen over controls. But even in this state, the war demanded compliance. There was no alternative. Each crew was a cog in an industrial-scale operation of destruction. Every mission not flown meant strategic failure, civilian casualties, and the endangerment of comrades. So they flew, they performed, even as their minds quietly unraveled. Sleep became impossible, or they slept only in short, fragmented bursts. Nightmares haunted the few hours of rest. Men dreamt of flak bursts, burning planes, screaming comrades. And when awake, their bodies acted automatically, emotionally detached. Some found themselves laughing at the deaths around them, not out of cruelty, simply because the mind could no longer process grief. By the 20th or 25th mission, the transformation was complete, faire wagon impide. The reality of death, for oneself or others, became abstract. Yet the body continued to operate, hands gripped joysticks. Fingers pulled triggers, feet pressed rudder pedals. This duality, functional yet hollow, defined the bomber crew's existence. Psychologists would later call this the perfect storm for emotional collapse. Continuous threat exposure, fear triggered daily, unrelenting. Predictable, mortality, death reduced to a statistic, stripped of emotional impact. Physical demands, operating machines while in high stress, low oxygen environments. Social isolation, cramped quarters, constant tension, absence of comforting normality. The human brain adapted. Itadto. But in adaptation, something essential was lost. These men became the first to show what millions of ground soldiers would later exhibit. A new form of war trauma, not explosive, but silent and cumulative. A man could survive 30 missions, return home physically intact, and yet, inside, he had already died emotionally. The bomber crews of World War II were the first generation to experience psychological collapse as a statistic, a systematic byproduct of modern warfare. Fear was no longer guiding behavior. It was measured, quantified, and eventually erased, and once it vanished, nothing could fully restore it. Fear is not only a survival mechanism, it is a moral compass. Humans are afraid. They consider sequences. They culture themselves butour terre. But what happens when fear disappears? When the emotional signal that warns, restrains, and guides is silenced? World War II gave the answer. On battlefields and in occupied towns, psychologists and historians observed a disturbing pattern. Soldiers who no longer felt fear also began losing empathy, compassion, and moral restraint. This is not to say they became monsters intentionally. They did not plot atrocities with conscious malice. They were hollowed out. Fear, in its normal state, constrains behavior. It prevents reckless actions. It forces humans to consider pain, consequences, and ethical limits. When fear is silenced, a vacuum forms. Into this vacuum flows. Détachement. A soldier stands over a battlefield littered with bodies. At first, instinct screams to retreat, to hide, to recoil. The mind registers horror, the heart pounds. But after months or years of relentless exposure, this reaction fades. The body continues to move. The hands continue to fire. The mind stops processing moral weight. Veterans recounted how ordinary men, farmers, clerks, sons, performed acts they would later call unthinkable. One German soldier wrote, "A first, premier, could not believe I was doing what I was doing. Later, I no longer questioned it. It was as though the mind had turned off the part that cares." In the Pacific Theater, Japanese soldiers trained under extreme indoctrination faced a similar psychological erosion. Exhaustion, starvation, and constant threat dissolved normal empathy. Even civilian populations became abstract targets, faceless, dehumanized, morally irrelevant. On the Eastern Front, both German and Soviet soldiers endured conditions that made emotional detachment a necessity. Every day brought images of friends, comrades, and civilians dying in unimaginable ways. To survive psychologically, soldiers suppressed the instinct to feel. But suppressing emotion in one area spills into others. Empathy and morality are costly cognitive processes. They require energy, attention, and emotional bandwidth. When a soldier's mind is depleted, moral reasoning falters. Fear and morality are intertwined. Fear warns the brain. Danger is here. Respect it. Protect yourself and others. Remove fear, and the lines between right and wrong blur. Military psychiatrists after the war described this as moral numbing. Soldiers would overlook civilian suffering, perform acts of cruelty without visible remorse, follow orders mechanically even when they violated personal ethics. These behaviors were rarely about ideology alone. They were the byproduct of emotional exhaustion. In Auschwitz, Dachau, and other concentration, related battle zones, psychological studies later showed that many perpetrators described feelings of detachment rather than hatred. Their actions were guided by procedure, habit, or necessity. Fearlessness had silenced the internal brakes that once prevented harm. Even ordinary, frontline soldiers displayed similar patterns. A Soviet memoir described infantrymen walking past dying comrades without response. A Japanese diary recounted soldiers burning villages while the mind felt empty and heavy like walking underwater. An American report noted troops executing prisoners without visible reaction. "We had no time for feeling," one man explained. This phenomenon was more than individual pathology, it was systemic. When entire units experience emotional numbing, morality as a collective force erodes. Orders that once felt horrifying become ordinary. Ethics are replaced by functionality. Survival is the only metric left. What made this terrifying was its subtlety. Une leak. Panic or breakdown, moral collapse is quiet. It is invisible until it manifests in irrevocable actions. World War to taught the world a lesson about human fragility. The same psychological mechanisms that protect life can also preserve function at the cost of ethics. Emotional survival can supersede moral reasoning. In extreme war, the human mind can survive, but the moral self can die. This is why historians sometimes describe the war not only as a battle over territories, but as a battle over humanity itself. Fear was not just a personal experience. It was a social regulator. It restrained violence. It allowed empathy to function. Once fear vanished, morality weakened. And when morality weakened, ordinary people committed extraordinary acts. Psychologists would later use these observations to understand atrocities. It was not just ideology. It was exhaustion, emotional depletion, and the systematic erasure of fear. Soldiers returned from the war physically alive. Butin cide. Some carried the remnants of a mind that had survived only by switching off the part that cared. Moral collapse, like fearlessness, was silent. It crept in unnoticed. It lingered long after the battles ended, and it left scars that no medal could honor and no photograph could capture. In World War II, the day soldiers stopped feeling fear was also the day morality became optional. And for many, once the mind surrendered fear, nothing could restore it completely. By 1943, military commanders across all fronts had begun to notice a disturbing pattern. It was not panic or cowardice that troubled them. It was the opposite. The most fearless soldiers, the ones who no longer flinched at artillery, who walked calmly across open ground, who laughed at death, were the ones most likely to become liabilities. This was a silent epidemic, and it terrified commanders. In traditional military thinking, courage was praised. Fearlessness was honored. Medals were awarded to those who stood firm under fire. But what if fearlessness was not bravery, but collapse? Field reports began to reflect a worrying reality. Soldiers volunteering for suicide missions. Troops ignoring orders to seek cover. Men failing to respond to tactical commands because emotional detachment replaced judgment. Officers observed that when fear disappears, so does caution. Risque assessment essential for survival and unity cohesion, function. This was particularly visible on the Eastern Front. Commanders saw soldiers crossing minefields with an eerie calm. They witnessed infantry walking into machine gun fire without hesitation. They watched men act as if death were irrelevant, because, to them, it was. Medical officers used new terminology: combat exhaustion, battle fatigue, and emotional numbing. They recognized that the outward calm was a warning, not a virtue. Rotations were introduced. Troops were removed from front lines, not only way, but also when. They no longer showed fear. One U.S. Army psychiatrist noted, "The men who frighten the officer most are the men who seem fearless. They have passed the threshold where the mind can still judge, still hesitate, still protect itself." Commanders had to balance operational necessity with psychological preservation. On bomber missions, the calculation was brutal but precise. Aircrew who appeared calm and efficient were closely monitored. Those showing signs of detachment were rotated or grounded, not because of incompetence, but because their risk-taking behavior could cost lives. In infantry units, the challenge was even more subtle. How do you manage a soldier whose mind no longer registers threat? How do you prevent a unit of fearless men from becoming a collection of suicide candidates? Field manuals evolved. Warning signs were codified: emotional flatness, lack of reaction to nearby death, indifference to personal danger, unusual recklessness. Yet these signs were often difficult to detect in the chaos of combat. Commanders also had to contend with morale. Fear, paradoxically, sustains cohesion. It creates a shared reality. When soldiers stop fearing death, they no longer process it in the same way as their comrades. They may take unnecessary risks, endangering the group. The epidemic of fearlessness forced militaries to confront a painful truth. Psychological collapse does not always look like panic. In fact, it is often invisible, silent, deadly. One British officer reported, "Our men who seem fearless are often the ones we lose first. They move as if impervious to harm, but impervious to harm is not the same as invincible." The phenomenon was widespread. In the Pacific Theater, officers observed Japanese soldiers walking into certain death without hesitation. In Europe, both German and Soviet units showed the same patterns of detachment after prolonged exposure to artillery and sustained combat. Medical interventions were limited. Rest periods, rotations, and counseling were introduced, but the understanding of long-term effects was minimal. Many soldiers returned to the front before their psychological systems had recovered. The silent epidemic continued, invisible to those who equated outward calm with resilience. Commanders faced a chilling dilemma: push units forward, risking loss of detached soldiers; pull soldiers back, potentially reducing operational strength. There was no easy choice. In reports across multiple armies, officers began referring to the day the men stopped fearing death, the day when fear ceased to guide behavior, and discipline, instinct, and caution began to erode. This was more than a psychological phenomenon. It was an operational hazard. Military leaders learned to monitor not just physical injuries, but emotional signs. They began to rotate soldiers based on subtle indicators of detachment. They recognized that emotional numbing could precede outright breakdown. Yet, even with these measures, the epidemic persisted. Soldiers who survived weeks or months at the front often returned from rotations emotionally hollow. Some could function in base camps, training others, or performing administrative tasks. But when redeployed, their fearlessness, once a survival mechanism, could once again turn lethal. World War II revealed a terrifying truth to commanders: fear is not weakness, it is a tool. Fearlessness is not always heroism, it can be collapse. Absence of fear creates unpredictability, inefficiency, and risk. This silent epidemic was an invisible enemy, as deadly as bullets or bombs. Commanders feared it more than cowardice, because cowardice can be corrected, managed, or punished. Fearlessness that arises from psychological collapse cannot be disciplined. It must be treated, rotated, or monitored, a difficult and subtle intervention in the chaos of total war. By 1944, military manuals quietly acknowledged the phenomenon, emphasizing rest, observation, and rotation. But the understanding remained incomplete. No officer could fully anticipate which soldier had crossed the invisible threshold. In the end, The silent epidemic commanders feared was not a visible army. It was an erosion of human instinct, a quiet collapse of the mind, and the hidden cost of modern warfare. The lesson was stark. A soldier who stops fearing death is not a hero, he is a warning. And the war itself is the mechanism. The Goen fell. Silent, the bombs stopped dropping, the front lines dissolved. Yet, for millions of soldiers, the war did not end. They returned home. They stepped onto familiar streets. They embraced families and friends and felt nothing. The same soldiers who had survived artillery barrages, snipers, and night raids were now facing a new battlefield, the one inside their own minds. They had endured unimaginable trauma. Their bodies were intact. Their medals gleamed, but inside they were hollow. Psychologists today recognize this as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. At the time, it had no name. There were no structured treatments. There was only silence, isolation, and social misunderstanding. Many veterans described feeling emotionally dead. They could not cry. They could not feel joy. They could not feel fear. Even love seemed distant, alien, almost irrelevant. One American soldier recalled, "I came home, and everything looked the same, but I felt like I was watching from the outside. I could touch my wife, hear my children laugh, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore." This was not uncommon. War had rewired their brains. Fear had been exhausted, or emotions had been muted. Empathy had been suspended. The mind had survived by cutting itself off from the very sensations that make life meaningful. Some men turned to alcohol. Others withdrew into silence. Some took dangerous risks, as if testing the boundaries of their emotional numbness. Famille struggled to understand. They could see the uniform, the medals, the stories of heroism. But they could not reach the person inside. Society had no vocabulary for this condition. There were no support systems. The soldiers were expected to reintegrate seamlessly, as though surviving the war had magically restored them. Many failed. Divorces rose. Suicides increased. Men wandered aimlessly, searching for a way to feel again. Some sought danger, repeating the war's trauma in civilian forms. Reckless driving, fights, or hazardous occupations. Even those who seemed to recover fully carried invisible scars. Certain sounds triggered memories of battle. Explosions, fireworks, even the backfire of a car could send them into panic, flashbacks, or dissociation. They were haunted by experiences that civilians could barely comprehend. The war had permanently altered their perception of life and death. Some described a sense of time distortion. Moments of peace felt unreal. Die stretched endlessly. Years collapsed into a single memory of chaos. Others reported a pervasive sense of guilt, not for acts of bravery, but for acts of survival. Why had they lived when friends had died? Why had they taken actions to preserve themselves while others perished? Tissure vivant as guilt, compounded, emotional as military psychiatrists, observing the same patterns across armies and continents, began to understand the long-term implications of prolonged fearlessness. World War II had not just killed bodies. It had damaged minds in ways society could barely measure. The silent epidemic of fearlessness, the numbing of emotion under relentless combat, followed men home. It was invisible but persistent. It affected their relationships, their work, their communities. Children grew up with fathers who could not feel, mothers married to men who were emotionally absent, and communities populated by men whose inner lives remained at the front. Eroded. Later, survivors would describe the same haunting sensations. I can remember the battle like it was yesterday, but I can't remember the day I returned home. It's as if the war never ended inside me. Therapists today recognize that recovery is possible, but it requires time, care, and understanding that was absent in the 1940s and 1950s. For those soldiers, the psychological war never truly ended. It had simply moved to a different theater, the mind. The battlefield was now quiet, but the enemy remained. Fearlessness, once a survival mechanism, had become a lasting wound. The absence of fear allowed them to endure death, but it also deprived them of life. Families learned to live alongside invisible ghosts. Communities learned to function with men who were physically present but emotionally distant. And for the soldiers themselves, the memory of war became both a shield and a prison. A shield because it had forged resilience beyond ordinary human limits. A prison because that resilience came at the cost of emotional depth, moral intuition, and the capacity to feel fully alive. The war ended, but the consequences lingered. The human mind, stretched beyond its design, had survived, but survival had a price. A price measured not in medals or accolades, but in silence, emptiness, and the shadow of lives half-lived. World War II left an entire generation bearing the mark of invisible wounds. And for many, the question remained, what does it mean to survive if the mind that survives is no longer fully human? World War II was not just a war of armies, weapons, and nations. It was a war against the human mind itself. No previous conflict had exposed soldiers to the same relentless combination of threats, scale, and psychological stress. The reasons are multifaceted, but they converge on one terrifying truth. To systematically eroded human resilience in ways that previous wars had never done. 1. Scale and duration. In previous conflicts, battles were often localized, sieges ended, armies withdrew, campaigns paused for the seasons. In World War II, fronts stretched across continents, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia, from the jungles of the Pacific to the rubble-strewn cities of Europe. Soldiers faced continuous exposure. Fighting lasted years. Days bled into nights, weeks into months, months into years. There was rarely respite. Psychologically, the human mind can handle acute stress, a sudden threat or a short battle. Chronic exposure, however, depletes the nervous system. Stress hormones remain elevated, sleep is fragmented, emotional processing shuts down. Soldiers were not broken by a single shell, bomb, or battle. They were broken by relentless repetition. 2. Mechanized death and impersonal killing. WW2 introduced industrial-scale killing. Artillery, barrages that lasted hours, carpet bombing of cities, naval bombardments. Death became statistical, impersonal, and omnipresent. For a soldier, a single bullet or explosion was terrifying but comprehensible. Thousands of deaths across the horizon were abstract. The brain could not emotionally process the scale. This led to emotional numbing. Men who would have reacted with horror till one corpse could walk past dozens, hundreds, even thousands, without visible reaction. The mind had to detach to survive. 3. Technological advancements. World War II introduced weapons that previous generations could not have. Imagined bombers raining destruction from the skies, artillery capable of leveling entire towns, tanks and mechanized infantry that moved faster than human intuition could track, submarines and naval warfare that made the sea itself a threat. These technologies increased unpredictability. A soldier could perform flawlessly and still die instantly. Another could make a mistake and survive. This eroded the brain's ability to predict outcomes, destroying the psychological feedback loop that fear reliant. Fear work because it warns danger existe and certain actions mitigate. When danger becomes random, fear loses its meaning. 4. Psychological warfare and ideology. Unlike previous wars, WW2 integrated psychological warfare into combat. Propaganda, indoctrination, and dehumanization were tools used against both enemies and one's own troops. Nazi Germany's propaganda machinery, Soviet ideological training, Japanese militarist indoctrination, these systems conditioned soldiers to suppress moral hesitation and override empathy. Coupled with the physical stress of combat, soldiers became psychologically optimized for obedience and emotional suppression, yet vulnerable to moral and emotional collapse once fear was exhausted. 5. Civilian involvement and total war. W2 was a total war. Civilians were targets. Cities were battlefields. Homes were destroyed. Families were killed. This blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant. Soldiers constantly faced moral dilemmas, observing atrocities and sometimes participating in them under orders. When fear numbed soldiers, moral reasoning faltered. Ordinary people committed extraordinary acts of cruelty, often without hatred, but because their emotional systems were exhausted. 6. Global scale and cultural differences. W2 brought together millions of men from vastly different cultures, languages, and belief systems. This reduced social cohesion, making isolation more acute. Soldiers could not rely on familiar social cues or communal reassurance, exacerbating stress, loneliness, alienation, and alien moral expectations contributed to psychological erosion beyond anything previous wars had caused. 7. Prolonged exposure without recovery. In earlier wars, soldiers might be rotated out or campaigns might pause. W2's operational tempo rarely allowed rest. The human mind requires downtime to process trauma. Without it, emotional systems shut down. By 1944, military psychiatrists began to recognize patterns: fearless behavior on the front line, emotional detachment, moral numbing, dissociation. Long-term post-combat dysfunction? These were not isolated incidents. They were predictable consequences of the war's scale, technology, and tactics. In summary, soldiers faced continuous, chronic exposure to lethal stress. Death became impersonal, abstract, and overwhelming. Technology introduced unpredictability that disabled fear responses. Ideological conditioning and total war eroded empathy and morality. Rotations and downtime were insufficient. Entire armies were exposed simultaneously, creating systemic psychological collapse. World War did not just kill bodies, it reshaped minds in ways never before seen. It demonstrated that when fear is exhausted, humanity itself can be compromised. This is why WW2 broke more minds than any conflict before it, not because soldiers were weaker, not because the enemy was more ruthless, because the machinery of war, combined with relentless exposure, created conditions the human brain was never designed to endure. By the war's end, millions of men survived physically but carried invisible wounds that would echo for decades. Their resilience came at a cost: fearlessness, moral detachment, and emotional numbness. W2 was not only a global conflict. It was the first war in human history to systematically test the limits of the human mind, and to find them broken it happened quietly. Terroano. Announcement at no signal, no dramatic moment on the battlefield. And yet, for millions of soldiers, a day arrived when fear simply ceased to exist. It was not courage. It was not mastery over danger. It was exhaustion of the mind, of the body, of the very mechanisms that had evolved to protect them. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the burning cities of Europe, from the jungles of the Pacific to the skies over Germany, men reached a breaking point. They had survived artillery barrages. Announcement at no signal, no dramatic moment on the battlefield. And yet, for millions of soldiers, a day arrived when fear simply ceased to exist. It was not courage. It was not mastery over danger. It was exhaustion of the mind, of the body, of the very mechanisms that had evolved to protect them. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the burning cities of Europe, from the jungles of the Pacific to the skies over Germany, men reached a breaking point. They had survived artillery barrages. That lasted for days. They had witnessed comrades killed instantly by snipers. They had flown hundreds of bombing missions, each more dangerous than the last. They had been exposed to dehumanizing propaganda and ideological conditioning. And the human brain, remarkable as it is, had limits. Fear, the most basic of survival instincts, is not infinite. It is a signal, a guide, a warning. When it is silenced, so too is the mind's natural, moral compass, empathy, and emotional processing. Zev. Soldiers who reached this point did not panic. They did not collapse in terror. They moved, they acted, they survived, but they were no longer fully human. Psychologists later described this state as emotional, numbing, and psychological dissociation. The body remained functional, the mind did not. A soldier could shoot, march, operate machinery, and follow orders. But inside, he felt nothing. Joy, grief, love, horror, all were muted or absent. Some men experienced relief in this detachment. No more shaking hands. No more nightmares in the moment of combat. No more crippling fear before an attack. But the relief was deceptive. Fear is not just emotion, it is information. It tells the body when to seek cover, when to retreat, when to survive. Without it, instinct falters. Commanders realized too late that fearless soldier pribo, uncontrollable entre them somrads. On the Eastern Front, soldiers walked across minefields as if the ground. Elle de nos dangers. In bomber formations, crews laughed as flak shredded the sky around them. In urban combat, men moved calmly through rubble while death waited at every corner. Fearlessness became a weapon turned inward, eroding discipline, morality, and self-preservation. Even after the war ended, the consequences endured. Men returned home physically intact. Yet their minds were haunted by a silence that civilians could not understand. They felt disconnected from their families, from society, from life itself. The war had ended, but for them it never truly did. Many struggled to feel anything at all. Love, grief, empathy, emotions that had once guided them were muted. Survivors' guilt gnawed at them. Memories of war replayed endlessly, sometimes fragmented, sometimes hauntingly vivid. Some turned to alcohol, drugs, or reckless behavior to fill the void. Others withdrew entirely. The absence of fear, once a survival mechanism, had become a lasting wound. The mind had survived by shutting off emotion. The price of survival was a profound disconnection from life. World War II demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than any previous conflict, that war is not only a physical struggle but a psychological one. It showed that human beings can endure unimaginable suffering. But it also revealed the limits of that endurance. When fear is stretched to its absolute limits, the mind adapts, it detaches, it numbs, it survives. But in surviving, it loses something essential. This is the paradox of war. The very mechanisms that allow humans to endure, fear, emotion, empathy, can also be exhausted. Wenteas bevive in a soul ascent. Historians, psychologists, and veterans agree, World War II did not just destroy bodies. It destroyed innocence, morality, and emotional depth on a scale never seen before. And yet, in the quiet moments, the surviving soldiers carried with them a profound testimony that humanity can endure anything, but not without leaving parts of itself behind. The day soldiers stopped feeling fear was the day the war reached its deepest psychological cost. It was invisible, silent, and universal among those who had been exposed to the relentless machinery of total war. It was not a day marked on calendars or in history books. It was a day etched in the minds of millions, a day when fear no longer guided action, when survival required detachment, and when the mind learned to endure by numbing itself. Complètement. World War II, in its horror and magnitude, revealed the most terrifying truth about human resilience. Survival is possible, but it comes at a price. A price measured not in medals, victories, or territory, but in the quiet emptiness left inside the mind, a silent battlefield that lasts long after the last shot is fired. And for the soldiers who survived, the war was never over. It had simply moved inside themselves.